don't you realise there isn't any money? Don't you realise the debt's going up? Don't you realise that this debate is about, it is doing nothing to deal with our actual problem? It's just an obvious fact that if we go into the next election with a divided right, then we can't win. That's just electoral arithmetic. One of the things that worries me is that if the leader doesn't win with a very clear mandate for certain things, then we're just going to descend into another round of internal argument about what happens next, and I don't think we can really afford that.
Welcome to the Danube Institute Podcast. I'm Callum Nicholson, the Director of Research at the Danube Institute. With me today is our visiting media fellow, Gavin Haynes, and our guest today is our visiting fellow, Lord Frost of Allington, a British peer, a former British diplomat, civil servant and politician. Among many other roles, he has served as Minister of State at the Cabinet Office in 2021, and perhaps most famously was the chief negotiator for exiting the European Union from 2019 to 2020. And he's with us today to talk about really two things. First, the future of the right in the UK. We're in the context of a British leadership election in the Conservative Party. And also, we want to have a general discussion of the future of the West more generally. So first of all, I thought we could begin by talking about the Conservative leadership race right now, and the future of the Conservatism and the future of the right in the UK. And I thought I'd hand it over to Gavin for this.
Yes, so the leadership election is about to shake out. We're going to have the budget event in the middle of the week, and then almost immediately after that, we're going to have the results of this interminable process. And it is down to two candidates, Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch, slightly unusual in that they are both what we might call candidates of the right. To my mind, it's been quite an interesting race. There has been much more policy, a much more attempt to grapple with fundamental reality than I've seen from a Conservative leadership race in, 2017, 2019, 2022. All of the Conservative leadership races, perhaps back to, Portillo in 2001, were they grappling with fundamental reality then? And so I was just wondering, Lord Frost, what is your take on this at this point? Because you are backing Robert Jenrick. Robert Jenrick has emerged as the candidate of the right, and he also seems to be the only one who understands that the game now is to outflank Reform. Reform are going to take 20% of the vote in the next election, it would appear, and what any Conservative leader needs to do is to engage with that and bring that vote back into the tent some way. If indeed there is a path forward, it might simply be a matter of there being some sort of alliance coalition between the fractured right. So it seems, however, that on present polling, there was a Conservative Home poll late last week, which came out, and they are the sort of definitive pollers of the internal Conservative Party, that Mr. Jenrick is going to lose and Kemi Badenoch is going to win. Do you think the Conservative Party is facing up to the fundamental realities that now present themselves?
Well, thanks, Gavin. There's a lot there, and I think we are beginning to, is the honest truth of this. There's a lot to be done, and a couple more bad decisions could end up being very difficult for the party. So there's a lot we've got to get right. As you say, I'm supporting Robert Jenrick, and I think, the emerging difference between the two of them, between him and Kemi Badenoch, other than personality to some extent, is that Rob Jenrick is much more focused on the specifics of policy. So the commitment to leave the ECHR, to have an immigration cap, to repeal or amend parts of the Equalities Act, net zero, and so on. Whereas Kemi has kept the debate more at the level of principles. We need to rediscover what we stand for, and so on. And without getting into the ins and outs of the contest, one of the things that worries me is that if the leader doesn't win with a very clear mandate for certain things, then we're just going to descend into another round of internal argument about what happens next. And I don't think we can really afford that. Still, there we are. There's only a few days left. Apparently, according to the media, turnout has been quite low. So maybe it's going to remain low, or maybe people are waiting till late on to make their mind up about the candidates. Nobody's quite sure about that. I don't think any of the polls are really that reliable. It's probably fair to say most people think Kemi is the favourite, but nobody really knows, and we just got to wait and see, I think, till later this week. So, that's where we are. And the reform challenge, I think Rob is the one who's kept up, has been most willing to talk about that in a serious kind of way. To me, it's just an obvious fact that if we go into the next election with a divided right, then we can't win. That's just electoral arithmetic. And therefore, we have to do everything we can to knit the right back together. And Rob's strategy, I think is the correct one, is to, at this stage anyway, is to turn the Conservative Party back into a genuinely conservative party, which we should have been a long time ago. We've drifted away from it, and start pulling back reform voters in that way, showing them we're the party that they want us to be. And that's why it's so important to be specific about some of the policies at this early stage. But who knows? I mean, the last problem we've got is just such a low level of trust after the last 14 years. Lots of people say, well, why should we believe you this time on the important stuff? And that may be what makes it difficult to get people back from reform. But you never know till you try. And I think that is the right strategy.
I'm just wondering if, looking at the Reform Party, obviously there's some parallels to the Brexit Party in 2019, and to a great extent the Brexit Party was a protest vote. It flared up and then it died away again after the election. To what extent do you think Reform can be seen in a similar light, or do you really think it represents something very different in Conservative politics, or indeed British politics in general?
I think it's an open question at this stage. I mean, the Brexit Party was definitely a party that, it was single issue. It was created for an event, which was to get rid of Theresa May and get Brexit back on track. And it succeeded in that. And once the context had changed, it disappeared. I think reform could be something else. It's obviously sold as something else. I think the real issue, I suppose, I would say the Conservative Party has created the space for reform as a political movement by vacating mainstream Conservative policies. And, every time in the past, the Conservative Party has thought, well, they've got nowhere else to go. They'll always end up voting for us. And that's what's produced this drift to the Lib Dem centre. Nigel Farage has created somewhere else to go. And I think the question is, can he turn it into a genuinely organised political movement with associations, a canvassing, campaigning effort, a kind of degree of solidity, I suppose, to the party around a set of policies that it hasn't had so far? And that certainly seems to be their intention, but I don't think they've done it yet.
Well, why do you think the Conservatives have stepped away from mainstream Conservative policies? You say they've slipped to the Lib Dem centre, and to some extent, I mean, I look at it and I see there's a sort of a great sort of kind of neoliberal technocratic consensus in the centre of politics across the Anglosphere. And I look at Rishi Sunak, and to some extent I look at Keir Starmer, and they seem very similar in some ways, quite technically minded people. I don't really see them having much in the way of political, I suppose, a political intuition. And what do you think's happened?
I mean, it goes back very deeply, I think. Some of it goes back to the mesmeric hold that Tony Blair and the Blair government as campaigners had over Conservatives for many years. And, the sense that was the only way to do politics and the best way to do it was to imitate Blair. I think some of it has been it's the legacy of EU membership, and obviously when you're in the EU, you're kind of held by this what's the word? Sort of technocratic governance mechanism that is very difficult for other opinions, at least until very recently, to get a say in, and that's kind of dominated the political scene while we're in the EU, and we haven't entirely shaken it off even now. I think there's this belief that elections are won from the centre, and the right thing is to triangulate all the time and, you know, put your policies halfway between the so-called right and the left. I think for the Conservative Party specifically, being in coalition with the Lib Dems for 5 years has meant some of this has entered the DNA, and some of the modernisation of the party has brought in, you know, people from, you know, rightly brought in people from different backgrounds, but it turns out that quite a few of them, you know, had rather weak Conservative DNA, I would say, and that's kind of played out in some of the internal debates too. So there's, you know, all these forces have kind of pushed us in that direction. I suppose the last thing is, you know, what I call the red wall fallacy, you know, the Boris Johnson's winning of lots and lots of seats in Northern England that used to be Labour. We drew the incorrect conclusion from that, which is that the best way to keep them was to have sort of sub-Labour high-spending policies, rather than to say these people are actually Conservatives and we should give them Conservative policies, which in my view would have been the correct route. So I think all of these things have, you know, pulled the party to the left, and, you know, we've created space on the right, and we've now got to move back. That's the basic problem we face.
We're talking about stepping away from mainstream conservative policies, and for international listeners on this, what precisely are the sort of conservative policies that have been abandoned by the mainstream, or by the actual Conservative and Unionist Party over the last few years, do you think?
I suppose you would say that or you could say that to some extent the party's transformed itself from a Thatcherite, you know, sort of fairly free market, fairly nationalist party. Over the years, it's transformed itself into something much more like a European Christian Democrat party, and it's got, you know, to a much greater extent, comfortable with high levels of tax and spending and redistribution. It's got comfortable with the kind of phenomenon of the active state, you know, the belief that the state has to be there to support people, help them gain skills, you know, be there for every problem. And we have bought into fashionable views like the climate crisis, so-called the net zero economics, and the belief that, you know, clearly many across Europe, or the intellectual elite across Europe have anyway, which is that borders don't matter, countries don't matter, cultures don't matter that much. Now, those are not, you know, they're not the only views in the Conservative Party, but they're much, much stronger than they would have been probably 10, 15 years ago. And that's, you know, it has become a different party in some ways, and that's what's created room on the right for reform.
It does strike me that the mainstream of both parties seem to be very worried about offending sort of Islington sort of middle-class sensibilities over lots of issues, to say anything that could be seen as provocative in any way.
I think that is a problem. It's becoming less of a problem, I would say, as political debates got a bit more forceful again. You know, here in Britain, the Brexit debate has kind of, you know, it's had pros and cons. It's brought a pretty aggressive, robust tone to politics at times, but it has also kind of forced people out to make the arguments and not worry about shocking people quite so much as they used to.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Jenrick campaign, one of the things that's been really bracing and interesting is this sense of, like, you can just do things. You know, him coming out and saying Chris Carver was a bad guy, Hamas are terrorists, two very simple statements, but he will sort of stand there on television and just defend them and not need to couch it in this sort of very metropolitan sort of post-Blairite, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand, sensitivities and stakeholders chat. And to me, if there is a way forward for British politics, I think it lies in that. We saw some of that from Badenoch back in the day. I haven't seen so much of it in this campaign, but it seems like there is something there about the Conservative Party rediscovering an authentic spirit of adversarialism. And obviously the metropolitan class take a very dim line on this. If you look at the papers, they will often say things like, "Oh, he's very divisive. Oh, he doesn't, he's not really speaking across the divide." Well, politics is essentially divisional. That is sort of the point of politics, and the point is to rally a coalition behind yourself. And I guess this idea that has grown up in the Blair era that the centre is where you win elections has never quite gone away, despite Boris's mandate in 2019. There are many different visions of Britain, many different narratives, and the point of politics is to sell yours, whether that's on the right or the left, or indeed in the centre.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think politics is, we've forgotten that politics is about persuasion. And to persuade people, you've got to be authentic and kind of genuinely believe what you're trying to persuade people of. So the two things go together, I think. And that is what we've got to get back to. I think there's been too much of a sense that, as I said, you triangulate, you look at what people think and try and give them a bit of what they want. And I think if that ever works, it doesn't really work now. You've got to set out a set of propositions and get people to agree to them. And that's why, a lot of people try and caricature Rob Jenrick as, only looking to the reform right and saying that's not enough. I mean, that's not what he said. He's been very clear. You've got to look a bit to your left as well. But the way to win people over from the left is not to, turn yourself into a slightly left-wing party. It's to persuade people that your ideas are the best ones for the country and to bring them in that way instead. And, we haven't talked for 20 years, best part of 20 years, about what, how a free market economy works, what conservatism means. We're very uncomfortable talking about national identity and culture and borders and all this sort of stuff. So it's not surprising that it doesn't immediately land now. But we've got to start talking about those things now because they're the key to winning again in 4 years' time. So I think Rob is absolutely right to start being clear about this. I think we've also seen, of course, that the Starmer government, the new Labour government, has been quite robust. It's done in many ways the same thing. It's come in and said, this is what we're going to do, and gone ahead and done it. And they've annoyed quite a lot of people. I don't think they've gone about it in a particularly in a way that's calculated to bring people with them necessarily, but they have done it. And a lot of people commented that it reminds people what a government can do when it just comes in and gets on with things. And we, by the end, as Conservatives under the Sunak government, had given up doing that. It was just trying to keep the ship afloat rather than to take it to any particular destination. And we've got to get this sense of momentum, direction, ideas back if we're going to win.
Absolutely, and the sense of being straight with the public. And, there's a budget event coming up in the next few days, and that will be a testing point for the new Labour government. And I think they have been weirdly honest with the public in some senses, in that we're just doing this and we're getting on with it and we're going to tear up the higher education free speech bill, etc., because that's what we want to do. But in another sense, British politics is still built on an inverted pile of piffle. There is just lies all the way down, because we're still having this debate about, we can't tax working people. Oh, well, this is what we meant when we said working people. And on it goes. And there's a penny on income tax and a penny off income tax. This time round, it's going to come from the national insurance rise for employers, which the Sunak government, of course, took that penny off of the employees, but it's still the same penny when it comes round. And it just seems that there is no sense that the great challenges that Britain is going to face over the next 5 or 10 years in terms of demographics, the fiscus, the worsening global situation, energy, defence, etc., is in any way on the table. And no one has sort of told the British people that we're broke and life is going to get harder. I suppose the Labour Party wouldn't tell them you need to get more competitive as a result of that, but it might be able to level with people in other ways, and we'll have to do more with less. And until we can start talking about those sorts of things, nothing will happen, and we'll still be locked into this post-Blair consensus. And I was wondering, as a man on the inside, are people facing up to this kind of fundamental reality? Is it just like, we'll tell the public that we can just take a penny off income tax and put a penny on income tax? Or do people understand the demographic realities of what's happened to this country?
I mean, the polling suggests kind of not yet, but I think kind of issue-based polling on these sort of issues is not really worth that much. I do think that increasingly the British people, British voters of all kinds, have got this sense that kind of something's gone wrong in the British political economy and society, and they'll attribute it to different things according to what they're interested in and their own background and where they live and so on. But the sense that our problems have kind of crept up on us, they're very serious. None of the political parties really have a plan to deal with it. I think that is growing, actually. I think it's connected, obviously, to some of the social change we've seen in the country in the last 20 years because of immigration, but not only because of that. It's connected to the fact that we've all got used to public services and economy that was growing at 3%. Our expectations are set by that, but in fact it's only growing at 0.5% to 1%, and eventually that catches up in you, and that's what we're seeing in public services. So I do think the sense that something's not quite right in British society and the economy is growing, but it's a long, long way from being a kind of political project, I would say, that people can tap into. On the other hand, it is something that can be shaped. And, I personally believe that a successful political party has an opportunity to shape that movement. It has an opportunity to say, look, this is how things are. This is what we're going to have to do. There is really no alternative to doing these things because we just can't go on as we are. And I think properly put, properly explained over time, you could start to build a coalition and a majority around that. That's kind of what the Thatcher government did in the 70s, just about got enough to take power, and then got lucky in what it was delivering, obviously. But I do think we've got to try and capitalize on this now, and sometimes I literally want to sort of shout at people almost like, don't you realize there isn't any money? Don't you realize the debt's going up? Don't you realize that this debate is about, it's doing nothing to deal with our actual problems or to grapple with them. But we're a long way, I think, in politics at the moment from really being able to address those. Task for the Conservative Party is to make it possible to address them, because there's no point in having policies that can't solve our problems just because they're the only ones that are politically acceptable. You've got to put forward policies that can solve the country's problems and make them politically acceptable, and that's really the task before us.
Is this not therefore a time when we need some sort of political leader or leadership in different parties who are actually trying to shape the narrative around what is the problem? Because I do find that what we have is a sort of zombie culture now that is still rehearsing the same old slogans and the same old problems. But I do feel that one of the major problems we have now is that no one really is quite clear about what is the fundamental problem that politics is debating. And if you go back to the 20th century, you had, at a global level, you had the communists and the capitalists, very different views, but actually they kind of agreed on the problem. They assumed the best way to understand and indeed act on the human condition was political economic. It was a question of, was it more state or more market? And sometimes now I'm really not sure what the shared problem is that all the parties agree on. I feel they're just simply rehearsing the things they were saying 10 years ago in different forms. And I suppose there's an implication for this for the leadership race, because I'm wondering, could you not make the case that whoever takes the leadership now in the Conservative Party will be a William Hague type character, a placeholder until something forms in the future? Do you think anyone who takes the leadership right now is really in a position to actually lead the party towards something in the future? Or is the cultural context too ambiguous at the moment to actually allow them to do that?
Well, I hope so. I believe so. I think we can't really continue with this kind of endless chopping and changing of leaders as a kind of proxy for policy change. I mean, of course, it's going to be very difficult, and nobody knows what's going to happen in the next few years. That's clear. But I think we should be electing somebody who intends and wishes and is thought to be taking us through to the general election. Because I think it's going to take that long to develop a proper political programme and crucially communicate it to people, get people to understand what the problems are and why these are the best solutions. And that does require quite a lot of continuity and consistency. So, I hope the inevitable turbulence doesn't just, result in more leadership speculation after a year or two. But, this is the Conservative Party, so of course you never really know. I think the other problem we've got is that, and it's not just a Conservative problem, most people in politics are not kind of great thinkers. Some are. Ideology has always been a kind of relatively small component of both parties, actually. Certainly the Conservative Party in Britain thinks of itself as a sort of non-ideological party there to govern and provide stability. So, the number of, we just aren't that many people who are thinking creatively and seriously about the current situation and what we do about it. And that's one of the reasons why you've got this sort of zombie debate about things that don't really matter any longer. Again, we've got to try and change that.
It is bracing to hear that there is now a kind of a bit more to be said about the social issues in the country, because, I think the one problem that the Conservative Party could very easily latch onto is just becoming obsessed by reheated Thatcherism again and again. But it seems to me that what people are looking for in 21st century Britain in many ways is a return to a life that is civil and civic and dignified. And some of that sort of Red Wall agenda, you could say the David Goodhart agenda, the Hans Hart, etc., is meant to do that. And then there's a more kind of fundamental thing just about behaviour in public spaces, crime, the weft of stuff that Tony Blair definitely started to put his finger on with the ASBO agenda, etc. And yet the situation has worsened, and someone needs to come in with an almost teacherly mode. I think Thatcher had a teacherly mode in the way she behaved, but she never spoke to the civics of the country, and indeed behaviour in schools under Thatcher got worse. And the society, when people look back on the sort of anomie and the dark side of that era, that's often the stuff that they remember, sort of emptying town centres and screw you buddy culture. So is there a world in which Britain can actually start to talk about those things? Because it's almost like a defect in the British character whereby they just don't want to tell other people no. And, I guess the sort of Starmer government does some of that in terms of the nanny state agenda, but that's almost like another thing. It's sort of a non-judgmental judgmentalism. And the Conservative response to that should be kind of the inverse.
Can I just supplement what Gavin just said there, actually? I've been thinking about this over the last few days, that it seems to be our entire culture in the UK has been infected by the customer is always right philosophy. It's a service culture philosophy from the States, where if you look at everything, then I remember when I was a student, when I was a high school student, we were still a little bit scared of the teachers. And then you went to university and you were very much in the space of the professor or whoever it was. And it was just coming in the culture that actually the students' opinion on this is what matters. And they would write. We started in my second year to write reports saying whether we thought the lecture was a good lecture. This sort of thing, sort of ordered culture. And it's the same with if you look at the identity politics now, we no longer have authorities on things. We just have authors. Everyone is an author of their own truth. Again, it's the idea that the customer is always right. And it seems even in politics, it seems to be the problem of the center is that politics haven't said we believe in something. It's saying, well, actually, we want them as voters. They're always right. And so we will simply go where the people, what is the, I don't know, it's a culture of blandishments, because blandishments are the least offensive to everyone. And I suppose that's what you're saying, Gavin, is that this that's the way I understand it anyway, is this culture of the customer is always right.
Absolutely, yeah. The world as consumer, and that is a spin-off of neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher's godchild. And we need to move past that somewhere on that, and I think the reheated Thatcherism agenda plays into that world where if we can just achieve 3% growth, then people will stop playing their phones out loud on buses, and our inner cities will stop being difficult places for women to walk at night. It's not going to happen.
No, of course, the view of reheated Thatcherism is kind of a oversimplification, because yes, Thatcher was a economic liberal. She was also a nationalist, for want of a better word. And I think it's very important for the Conservative Party in future to keep those two things kind of in line. I don't think it's right to say we can junk free market economics. We should be suspicious of multinationals. We should be kind of worried about the corrosive power of markets to destroy civic kind of engagement. I mean, all those things, there's an element of truth in them, but basically I think that, free markets, liberalism, giving as much freedom to people as possible, economically, the small state, low tax, low spend, those are the ways that generate growth. And you can't really get away with that if you want to keep growing and do all the other things that we want to do. But I do think it's crucial to keep it in parallel with, again, for want of a better word, I call nationhood, because I think the word of nationalism is just irredeemably tainted in Europe. But it's about rebuilding the country, to some extent making the state effective rather than ineffective, which it is at the moment. It's believing that borders mean something, controlling immigration means something. The mainstream national culture has a particular value. Law and order, crime, all these sorts of things that go to kind of construct the kind of non-economic, cultural, social, political life of the nation. In that area, we should be, pushing back against the extremes of social liberalism in all the different ways, and, trying to validate the British nation, the United Kingdom, as a valid kind of project. And it's got very, very undermined in the last 20, 30 years or so. So I think you've got to do these things together. What I'm very suspicious of, and I hear a lot of people on the right as well as the left talking about, is the idea you can use the state to kind of create artificially social cohesion and community and so on. I think that's always a kind of it's almost a kind of intellectual error, because the sort of communities that are created by state activity and spending aren't real communities. They're just sort of lobby groups. They're not organic. They're not people doing things in their own way. So, even in the Conservative Party, you hear a lot of people saying, we need a big state, we need a supportive state, we need a state that, kind of helps people through the troubles of life, builds communities, spends on social activities of one kind or another. And I basically don't believe that. I think it's a false trail. You have to get the state out of people's lives so that they can fill it with their own kind of beliefs and activities and communities and projects. And that's the only safe way of doing it. It's obviously a long, long way from where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I was interested in from the Jenrick campaign is that he would like to repeal the Equalities Act 2010. Caillou Calais Frabjous Day. It's one of the most pernicious bits of legislation in British public life that creates this public sector duties to always consider equality in decisions and creates effective affirmative action in all sorts of spheres of life. And I was just wondering, Lord Frost, how that plays into what you just said, because it seems to me that the Equalities Act is a clear case of law being upstream of culture. And in order to make, how British culture has been remade over the past few decades is often due to subclauses and Oxford commas in Blairite legislation that is half forgotten. And in order to remake British culture, surely one of the first things we need to do is create a new legal architecture which changes the incentive structure for the bureaucracy and thereby the classrooms, the entire establishment. And equally, there is a role for government to stop funding its enemies. One of the great errors of British politics of the past 14 years is that the British government funded Hope Not Hate reports that told them they were all fascists and Nazis and seeded this good quality data into public discourse through their friends at The Guardian, etc. Is law upstream of culture? And in terms of this revolution in the head that is going to be required to get anywhere at all at this point, is that feasible, and where do you start?
I mean, we have to try and make it feasible, and I think some of the unease that a lot of Brits feel about the way things are in the country is connected to this problem, the sense that there's this kind of legal cultural framework they can't unpick, and yet is sort of driving in certain directions. The Equalities Act is a really good example of it, because obviously, you've got the equality, the public sector duty that you talked about, which is this requirement to look at the effect of every policy on, every group and make sure it's not discriminatory. And obviously, that is like a massive, massive roadblock in doing all kinds of things. But the wider effect and wider society has been to encourage everybody to think themselves part of a group. And we're now seeing this phenomenon that every opinion, every religion, not just the mainstream ones, but like some of the fringe, odd ones, are all becoming kind of protected communities and groups. Everybody's kind of getting in on the act, because it seems like the only way to kind of secure your position is to define yourself as a protected group and therefore become immune from discrimination. And obviously that's that way madness lies, I think. It encourages everybody to not think of themselves as part of a society, but as part of a group, to focus on group rights, to think about what your group can get compared to everybody else. And I actually regard it as a bad sign, though it's a completely logical consequence, and one that many of us predicted, that we're now seeing sort of white men as the growth of that part of society as a protected group too. And, I just don't want to go down this road. I don't think we should think of ourselves in this way. But the Equality Act, which is very rooted in modern Labour semi-socialist philosophy, is creating it, and it's making it worse every day Labour is in power now. So I do think that, there's this drift. I mean, the way I look at it actually is there are two things going on as well as the economic problem. There's a kind of the gradual disintegration of traditional British ways of governing ourselves, the constitution, common law, the sense that everything was allowed unless it was specifically prohibited, all those sort of things. And then you've got the kind of growth of postmodern ideas, the kind of what is truth aspects of politics that's come in with woke identity. And they're both kind of feeding on each other in Britain. Britain's got this specific problem because being in the EU for so long has kind of Europeanized our traditional ways of governing ourselves, and we haven't rolled it back, and it isn't working very well, and it's allowing woke ideas to sort of prey on the system. So that's the particular British form, I would say, of the wider problem.
One thing, actually, you mentioned the law is the law upstream of culture, but it's another question: is the judiciary, or the courts upstream of the law? In a sense that it seems to be living increasingly, I've noticed I found the rhetoric. Well, obviously in America, the people are very quick to sue everyone, as an example, and I'm finding this sort of mentality increasingly evident in the UK. And I do find, to some extent, and maybe this is shifting to something else we wanted talking about, the state of the West in general, but I do find that whenever I hear the phrase decolonized curriculums, what I see is us in Britain being colonized by America's moral panics. And so I suppose it's a good way to pivot to a broader discussion here is, to what extent do you think one of the problems we're facing is the sort of Americanization of everything, not just in policy, but sensibility?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely do see this, and probably the role of the judiciary is kind of part of that. The Supreme Court has modelled itself on a US Supreme Court stroke ECJ type Supreme Court, even though that's not what their real powers are, is not how they were actually created. I think that's part of it. There's something that people call America brain in British politics, where they're kind of so overwhelmed and obsessed by kind of looking at American politics, the minutiae of it and how it works all the time, that it's playing back into how we think of things. I do think that, more broadly, which I think is what you really meant, obviously we are uniquely open to American culture and American obsessions, and so much of the so-called, for want of a better word, woke agenda has obviously been imported from the US, even if it may have started with European philosophers. It sort of took off in the US and has been imported back here. And, it's probably always been like that to some extent for the UK. It's just that I think some of our kind of ability to resist culturally, some of this has been weakened over the years by many of the other things we've been talking about. Maybe it's a bit stronger in continental Europe. That's perhaps why you've got this phenomenon in the EU now of, in some ways stronger resistance to woke ideas, the growth of, again, for want of a better word, sort of the return of nationalism, national culture, borders as a political force across the EU seems in some ways stronger than in the UK just at the moment.
There's a thought I've had around this of we often talk about these so-called woke ideas, and people see it as sort of a long march through the institutions of Marxism and so on. I have to say, though, I don't really, even if the ideological content is drawn from post-structural writers, postmodernists and so on, in the academy, it seems to me to be a fundamentally neoliberal phenomenon. I mean, if you look at all of the institutes, be they universities or governments, often the language and the practice of these ideas are being pushed through by HR departments. And HR departments are often presenting themselves now as your friend if you're the worker. But HR departments always worked for the man. They were always representing the institute to keep discipline in the workforce. And it seems to me that the effect of these sorts of policies, as much as the rhetoric around them is this sense of diversity, equity, inclusion, this very sort of well-meaning sentiment, I think the real effect in practice is to create a state of fear where employees feel insecure, fearful, and therefore more docile and more willing to accept anything. I'm wondering to what extent, as someone who's been quite critical, I think, of these sorts of woke ideas, so to speak, to what extent do you think they may simply be a product of not socialism, but sort of hyper-capitalism in this sense?
So I think I wouldn't say they're a product of hyper-capitalism. I think obviously to some extent the corporate world has kind of gone along with them, taken them up because they're convenient, useful, maybe in the way you suggest, for whatever reason. And I think there is certainly an intellectual current which it's important to resist, which says that because freedom in the economic sphere is important, freedom in every sphere is important. And the idea that there's really no moral reason to resist kind of anybody having the right to do anything much, is what's driven some of the extremes of the woke agenda in recent years. But I don't think you can extrapolate from one to the other. I think the freedoms that are necessary for economic life, you can't draw the conclusion from that anything goes in every other area of life. You can't draw the conclusion that anyone should be allowed to come to the country. You can't draw the conclusion that children should be allowed to do whatever they want in sort of social, sexual sphere. It just doesn't follow. Yet a lot of people kind of on the libertarian right, which is a very small group, admittedly, in the UK, do seem to think that it follows. And it's kind of discrediting the ideas as a result of it. So, economics is one thing, culture, society, the nation, that's a different thing. And the tools are different to produce successful outcomes in these two ideas. You can't generalize from one to the other.
And I think America Brain is something that's, absolutely inimical, and I hate it, and I see it everywhere. And I was just wondering, Lord Frost, we have a potential incoming American administration situation, sort of like a week out from that. It looks like it's going to be Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. That, to me, would be the first post-liberal administration in history. They have said that they want to impose tariffs, quite high tariffs on import goods, and rebuild US industrial capacity. Whether that will work is an open question, but they take a position on the politics of economics. And that is the world that Britain will potentially be going into. The special relationship, how special is it? We can get into the details of that. But, you're a former ambassador. You understand the sort of inside line on this. How do you think Britain and the Starmer regime will be able to cope with that incoming administration? And how do you think they will change the weather in the broader right and conservative movement? Because we've already got, Meloni in Italy is pursuing what I would consider a post-liberal line, and it seems like a future is starting to constellate.
Yes, the European post-liberals are, kind of fighting a culture that is deeply unsympathetic. If Trump does win in America, that will be a totally different thing. America is a continent, economically. I don't think tariffs are generally a good idea apart from for national security reasons. I don't think they're a good idea economically generally. But America could certainly cope with tariffs because it's a continent and it has relatively low levels of imports and exports. There'll be some effect, but it can cope with it. what effect will it have on the rest of us remains to be seen. I think the right thing for the UK to do in these circumstances is, not go down the same route ourselves. Obviously, that would be completely self-defeating. The correct thing to do, if we had a Conservative government, would be to liberalise economically, make the business environment in this country as good as we could possibly make it, and focus a lot on getting an FTA with the Americans. And it's a great pity that under Boris we didn't try hard enough in the window we had at the end of the last Trump government to get one. We should try and get under this tariff wall and be as close an ally of the Americans as we possibly can. I think the Starmer government will, we don't really know, because I don't think they've thought very hard about anything they're doing. And I think they're making it up to some extent on the run. But I think their instinct will be to say the only safe place in this sort of world is to be in a bloc, and to use this as an excuse to drift a bit closer to the EU than they might otherwise have felt they could, and to develop the argument that, all us Europeans must stick together against this, these crazy Americans. Of course, the argument doesn't entirely work, because, there's a strong sort of post-liberal stroke populist current of opinion in Europe as well now. But nevertheless, I think they'll try and make it, because that what's going on in Europe isn't well understood in Britain generally at the moment. So that's what would worry me. I think that will probably be the Labour reaction to this, and to, generally be very suspicious of it all in a way that I don't think will suit British interests, to be honest.
What do you think do you share Gavin's confidence that this will be a Trump victory in this election? And if not, if Harris wins, what do you think the consequences of that would be?
If Harris wins, obviously, the Starmer government will be delighted to see that as a vindication of all sorts of things. They'll sell it as a definitive swing against populism, all the terrible ideas associated with, Rob Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch reform, all this sort of stuff. And, I imagine they will try and get as close to the Harris administration as they possibly can. They'll present it as a kind of great global shift away from all these ideas. Of course, it won't be. It will just be a kind of, they just scrape over the line if the Harris government wins. I think the argument carries on, but it unfortunately definitely strengthens the Starmer government and its ideas in this country. Has to be said, of course, British public opinion is 2-1 in favour of Harris, it seems, to the extent people really, are following the detail of it. That's what the polls say.
And in terms of the broader right, it seems like, as I mentioned, Maloney, we now have Geert Wilders leading from behind in the Netherlands and coming up with, an immigration policy that 20 years ago would have been very much outside of the tent, even 2 years ago, in a sense. There are rightists in Czechia, in Hungary. There is a real wave sweeping through. It has different characteristics in each country, Sweden even. What are its similarities? What is the kind of global picture that's emerging, particularly in light of what's happening in America?
So I think there is a bit of a difference between European post-liberalism and the American version. As far as I can tell. There are overlaps and similarities, most obviously around kind of borders, immigration, culture, that sort of agenda. But, I think Trump's version of economics is very much, I want to make American capitalism work well for American workers. And he thinks he's got a different set of tools, but it isn't about changing the model. It's about making the American model work better. I think a stronger element in the European post-liberal populist politics is a kind of suspicion of capitalism that's always been strong on the European right as well as left, a sort of worry about Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism, if you like, and more emphasis on kind of protectionism, a sort of European culture being different. And I think that's why you've got sort of slightly different policy mix in lots of European populist parties. That, it's very much about, kind of high pensions, high benefits, kind of more of a sense of, what's the word, sort of protection and stasis of the way things are and making it work better, rather than the dynamism and change that I think is still associated with the Trump agenda. So there's a big overlap. I don't see them as necessarily the same things, and it's why I'm not quite so. I mean, I think there are reasons to be a bit concerned about European post-liberalism that don't necessarily exist in American populism.
I find America a bit sclerotic now. I think it's not quite the country it's not where we left it in the Reagan era. It seems like, with this sort of demographic change that has taken place in the past 30 years, etc., there is a much more European social ideal starting to be baked into the American model. And sure, you can still be sacked at 2 weeks' notice with no reason, and that is unique to the dynamism of American economics. But at the same time, I think Europeans would be slightly staggered, and I think Hungarians would be very staggered at how much Americans get in the way of social benefits and how much the state does put its hand out to certain people.
I do agree with that. I think my impression is that America has Europeanized quite a significant extent. When I lived in America in the late 90s, it felt like a different kind of society. Quite a bit harsher in some ways, and certainly the Overton window of ideas was different to that of Europe. I think that has changed, obviously, quite a lot. The growth of a genuine far left current and quite a strong one in the Democratic Party is another symptom of that. That's something I never expected to see, and now we do see it. So I certainly wouldn't say that there's a very stark difference between American society and European society, or American populism and European populism, but I think there is a difference, even so, in terms of some of the kind of the sort of ideas and the stories they kind of tell about themselves and what they're trying to do are still quite rooted in different sorts of cultures. And I think the UK still sits somewhere between those two things, isn't fully part of either, and is somewhat different to both, which can be an advantage or a problem depending on how we choose to use it.
Well, Lord Frost, thanks for coming on the program. I suppose the final thought is, when we look at, obviously, there's this leadership election right now, and you've been involved with that, and we were just talking about America, that it can't recapture the past, but I suppose the final question for you is, to what extent is the Conservative Party's future about trying to recapture things it was able to compel people with, or narratives it could tell that were compelling in the past, Thatcherism in a sense, or to what extent is it about forging something entirely new for the problems of the future?
I think it must be. It's a cliche, really, but I think it's kind of old wine in new bottles. Remaining true to our principles for the modern age. All this sort of thing. It sounds cliched, but I think it is still true that many of the principles Conservatives lived by. Free markets, economic freedom, a small state, the nation, the borders, culture. All of those things are still very valuable things. And you're right that it's very important not to keep harking back to Lady Thatcher all the time. That was a particular moment in British politics, and the world's moved on quite a lot from that. But I still believe, obviously I still believe, or I wouldn't be kind of where I am, that these principles are still the best way of running modern societies and democratic countries. And we've just got to explain them as the best way to kind of get the country back on the right path. Less fearful of the future, more believing that the life of your children and grandchildren can be better than your own life, and a lot of people don't believe that at the moment. And so we do have to use different words. We do have to situate it in the kind of modern era, but I still think the principles are the correct ones, and we shouldn't be embarrassed about that.
I'm wondering if the new slogan, sorry for the, this is probably a bit silly, but new wine in old bottles, maybe it could be the way forward. But so, Lord Frost, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Thank you also to Gavin for joining me today. And it's been a pleasure. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.